be the first of its kind in the state of New Mexico, and it would be focused on one issue and one issue only, and that is conviction integrity. It is the proposed first conviction integrity unit in the state of New Mexico. Now, unfortunately, we haven't had a hearing on that important funding request. We haven't had any luck yet in encouraging and recruiting the support of members of the New Mexico legislature to engage in this reform. But I'm proud to be joined today by Jeffrey Descovich from New York City and to talk about why this particular funding request is so urgently needed and so important. And it has to do with wrongful convictions. Every single year when I recruit new ADAs to the district attorney's office, I remind them of the solemn responsibility that they have to make sure that they exercise their discretion carefully, that they use the power that they have been given by the state cautiously and diligently to make sure that we do not participate in a system that leads to injustice. After all, our primary focus is to provide justice, to provide a sense of peace to the community, provide a sense of peace to our victims, but that mission is undermined and the credibility of the entire criminal justice system is called into question when we have wrongful convictions. We have, unfortunately, in this country, numerous examples of individuals who have been incarcerated and sentenced to lengthy years of incarceration in prisons across this country, including people who have been sentenced to death row in other states for crimes they simply have not committed. And this is a double injustice because not only is the criminal justice system contributing to the incarceration of innocent people, we're also leaving the real perpetrators, the real culprits of these crimes out in the community. And I have long believed that prosecutors, first and foremost, have an obligation to take a leading role and to be a leading voice for criminal justice reform, and specifically focused on the wrongfully convicted and the need to help exonerees. It is my intention and my hope as the next Attorney General in the state of New Mexico to advocate for a statewide conviction integrity unit that will be tasked with reviewing claims of actual innocence, where there is clear exculpatory evidence and evidence that the process itself has been tainted either by misidentification by eyewitnesses, faulty forensic evidence, poorly conducted custodial interrogations and interviews by police officers, and false confessions. All of these things need to be front and center inside this conviction integrity unit, and we must balance out the need for tough prosecutorial resources and police resources with a recognition that the system itself can use vast improvement in terms of providing substantive due process, not only before a criminal trial occurs, but after a criminal trial occurs. This recommendation for the legislature is actually part of a larger suite of recommendations that my office has advocated for a very long time, including expanded resources for pre-prosecution diversion, increased treatment for children with adverse childhood experiences, and new funding and support for exonerees and people who have been wrongfully convicted and subsequently released back into the community. We have an obligation to do justice. It is the charge of every prosecutor in this state, the charge of every prosecutor in this country, to make sure that they do everything in their power to ensure that the criminal justice system lives up to its highest ideals, to the community values of equal treatment, fair treatment, and above all, justice. And with that, I would invite Jeffrey to give a few comments, not only about his own experience, but his support for these initiatives. And I'm also proud to recognize the presence of Representative Patricia Roybal Caballero and Senator Bill Tallman, both strong supporters of these ideas and these initiatives, and I know people who will be strong advocates for the necessary reform that we need to undertake in the years ahead. With that, Jeff.
Good morning. My name is Jeffrey Descovich, and I was exonerated after spending 16 years in prison. My wrongful conviction was caused by a coerced false confession and prosecutorial misconduct, amongst other factors. I have a master's degree. My thesis is written on wrongful conviction Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice has freed 11 people and helped pass 3 laws. And then as part of the coalition group It Could Happen to You, we helped pass an additional 6 laws aimed at preventing false accusations and wrongful convictions. I speak today not on behalf of those organizations which cannot endorse in a political race, but instead as an individual. I simply shared that with you by way of sharing my background. There are a lot of things in Raul's plank, which I'm going to go over, which there's a lesson to be drawn from my case which supports it, as well as the wrongful conviction and exonerations across the country. I want to start out by quickly saying that the fight against wrongful conviction, while it devastates a defendant to be wrongfully convicted, as well as their family, in a larger sense it's a public safety issue, because every time the wrong person is convicted, it leaves the actual criminal free to strike again. That happened in my case. The actual perpetrator went on to kill a second victim just 3.5 years later after killing the victim in my case. Here in New Mexico, in the Martin's case, which I know Raul has received some criticism on, I think that my case has some things to speak about as far as that. That was involving a false confession. In my case, I had a false confession. Unlike Raul, my prosecutor simply prosecuted me based upon that false confession. He didn't stop and investigate. He didn't give pause when the DNA excluded me after the confession. Raul came into the case. He did further investigation. He found evidence of innocence, and ultimately he dropped the murder charges while the defendant was convicted of other crimes that she had committed. Had he simply gone ahead, he likely could have obtained a conviction, but it would have been a wrongful one. And that would have, again, not only devastated the defendant and the family, but also left the perpetrator free to strike again. As it stands now, at least the way is open for further investigation to continue, whereas when a conviction is obtained, there typically is no more investigation. So far as law enforcement is concerned, the case is finished. Speaking to the scope of wrongful conviction, nationally there have been 3,118 exonerations as of this morning per the National Registry of Exonerations. Here specifically in New Mexico, the registry references 10 exonerations here in New Mexico, and there's an additional 4 cases. When you look up the Ron Kiney exoneration back from 1976, Ron and his 3 co-defendants being exonerated. So that brings the aggregate of wrongful convictions here, specifically in New Mexico, at least as far as the ones that have ended in exoneration, at 14. But if there's nobody looking for those investigations, there's no conviction review unit looking for those wrongful convictions, and there's very little by way of resources in terms of nonprofit agencies and individual attorneys. If there's nobody looking for wrongful convictions, no wonder why the number of exonerations is so low. Things in Raul's plank that will address wrongful conviction. He mentioned the conviction review unit. It was only when a different district attorney took office that I was allowed to get further DNA testing. That was conviction review unit-esque. It involved a review and allowing of further testing. It's very important to have a statewide unit because often it becomes not about a quest for the truth amongst the district attorneys, but it becomes simply about winning. Often district attorney offices take unreasonable positions. They fight against exoneration even when there's exculpatory evidence, even when there's DNA evidence that doesn't match. The statewide conviction review unit that Raul proposes and that he'll implement if elected, working with the legislators to pass the laws necessary, that would remove that difficulty. So whenever there's a wrongdoing afoot by way of preservation of a wrongful conviction, Raul will be able to step in and do further investigation and go whichever way the evidence says. And if that supports an exoneration, that's what will happen. And if not, then the conviction will be preserved. But this is about innocent people. This isn't about freeing people indiscriminately. So that statewide conviction review unit is huge. DNA testing. On the legislative front, Raul will encourage the legislators to pass a law here in New Mexico which will allow DNA testing. I could not prove my innocence in New York until the DA allowed me to get further DNA testing. It shouldn't have been up to the DA. I should have had a right to have that. And had I not gotten that further testing, I wouldn't be standing here this morning with all of you. So that's definitely a message that's definitely an issue that my case speaks to. training. Raul will encourage law enforcement to do training when it comes to best practices in terms of videotaping and interrogations. The officers in my case that extracted a false confession out of me, they didn't have any training. He will educate law enforcement in terms of red flags as to that a confession may be coerced and false. The officers in my case had no such training. But he will also educate us to other red flags around identification evidence, which is a leading cause of wrongful conviction, and lying informants. When I was released with nothing. My life was hell for 5 years. It took 5 years for me to receive any compensation. Here in New Mexico, there is no compensation. Raul will advocate for exonerate compensation. Not only that, but also reintegration for exonerees. Things like housing, job training, counseling. These things are critical. Again, my life was very, very difficult for 5 years prior to receiving compensation. I got no assistance whatsoever from the state. And so as a result of that, I lacked stability of housing. I nearly went to a homeless shelter. I could not obtain gainful employment. And it took a long time for me to finally find somebody who was willing to provide me with counseling, just on a lien basis, just taking a chance that they would ultimately be compensated once I was compensated. But it should not come down to that. Raul advocates a database that will be public for officers that have been found to engage in misconduct. Things like giving false testimony, planting evidence, other key aspects of misconduct which have to do with the credibility of law enforcement. That's really critical. In my case, the medical examiner had been complained of in neighboring counties by authorities, but that information wasn't turned over to the defense, and there was no such database. So by analogy, from medical examiner to police officer, that's clear the value of that idea. It would provide important information for truth-seeking prosecutors to know, that a law enforcement officer has been found guilty of having done misconduct before. It would prevent officers from simply transferring from one jurisdiction where they were practicing law and getting in trouble to simply going to another one where the stage could be set for them to do that again. And needless to say, that will provide really important information for defense lawyers in advocating on behalf of their clients. So with that, I'm going to yield the podium. This is a potential game-changing election. It's a very ambitious yet doable platform that Raul is running on. Not only does it have the potential to cause wave-sending change throughout the state, but also nationally. I think it will encourage other candidates to run on this type of plank. In private conversations I've had with Raul, he's told me that he will be advocating for other attorney generals and district attorneys across the country to consider similar programs. For all of these reasons, I support Raul Torrez for New Mexico Attorney General. I formally endorse him. I've made political contribution for his race, and I ask everybody online that's joining us this morning, if you haven't contributed already, I'm asking you to contribute to support him at whatever level. Donations are not something that's limited to rich people, but anybody on any level, any amount will happen. In national races, candidates raise tens of millions or hundreds of millions even on what they refer to as small dollar donations. We need to do the same thing right here today throughout this campaign. He's being outspent by his opponent. We can't allow his message to be drowned out by sheer dollars. We need to contribute to his race as much as possible. With that, thank you very much for listening to me.
State Representative representing House District 13. And I'm part of a larger community group comprised of Chicanos, Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans that have for the past few years been preparing legislation and supporting legislation that takes a comprehensive approach to police reform, and acknowledges that communities of color have been disproportionately represented across the board to the through the legal process, and then, as it turns out, many factors playing into they being wrongfully convicted. And I think that the Conviction Review Unit will take this approach, and I think we need to talk about taking a justice approach to all that we do, so that we ensure that these communities, particularly communities of color that have been disproportionately represented in the law enforcement and in the penal systems and in the overall courts and corrections processes, that they be given that review in order to be able to determine and ascertain whether in fact their arrests were not part of a pattern that we've seen in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and in Las Cruces and other parts of the state. So for that reason, as a state legislator, having been part of this police transparency and accountability and taking a comprehensive and holistic approach, and fully supportive of the overall plan that Raul Torrez has embraced and is supporting as in his candidacy for Attorney General. It's taking this holistic approach to ensure that victims receive the support, victims receive the resources, but it is incumbent on the legislature to ensure that the Attorney General's office receives the adequate funding and resources to ensure proper staffing and to ensure proper programs are in place in order to address justice for our communities. And with that, I'm fully supportive of this plan and encourage all of the voters, especially with early voting beginning in person tomorrow, to go out and cast your vote in support of our restorative justice plan and program and Attorney General. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. I'm State Senator Bill Tallman, representing a portion of the Northeast Heights in Albuquerque. Okay, I'm a strong supporter of Mr. Torres because he's a very intelligent fellow, is very well educated, and has extensive experience as a prosecutor. He also is committed and dedicated to doing whatever it takes, go to whatever lengths to bring about justice for the citizens of New Mexico. Now, this is evidenced by what is happening today. He is committed and dedicated and wants to the state legislature to pass legislation in order to implement programs so that we'll never have a wrongful prosecution or conviction again in the state of New Mexico. Thank you for listening, and everyone, please remember to vote and vote for the Raul Torrez. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
With that, I want to thank Representative Robal Caballero again, and Senator Tallman, and most of all Jeffrey, for being here, for joining us. I think this is an important day for criminal justice reform in New Mexico, and I appreciate your support and help, and we're going to fight till the fight is won. Thank you very much.